of a war wasn't in anyone's interest. Stilicho took refuge in a church, but pretty soon Imperial soldiers came knocking. They had a letter stating that Stilicho was to be taken into custody. After being promised that their refugee was not going to be harmed, the priest stepped aside and Stilicho was led away. But as soon as the company passed the threshold of the church, the captain of the guard pulled out another letter. This one stating that for crimes against the state, Stilicho was to be executed at once. The few retainers left with the Vandal general tried to protest, but their master waved them off. He knew that his time had come. On August 22nd, 408, Stilicho was beheaded. He was 49 years old and had more or less been the ruler of the Western Empire for the last 13 years. Stilicho was among the last truly capable leaders of the Western Empire, and though his policies were at times controversial, they should all be seen as the work of a man trying to hold together a disintegrating empire with limited resources and enemies in every direction. Aside from his obsession with controlling the Eastern Court, Stilicho scrupulously maintained a pragmatic approach to war and politics, and he succeeded for more than a decade fell with the seasons. He was not a perfect leader, and I don't think his actions were always as noble and idealistic as some have made them out to be. But if you're going to have a guy utterly dominating a weak emperor the way that Stilicho utterly dominated Honorius, oh man, you could do so much worse. Next week, we will see just how much worse you can do. Because the minute Stilicho's head was separated from his body, it became clear to everyone just how many balls the Vandal general had been personally juggling. Anti-barbarian racism that Stilicho had kept in check is about to rise to the surface, which will drive all those carefully cultivated auxiliary forces into the waiting arms of Alaric. Petty personal squabbles will then lead to a breakdown of civility between Ravenna and the Goths, which will lead to another invasion, which will then lead to the first sacking of Rome in 800 years. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 100,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend a book that is extremely relevant to the history of Rome, but only on a meta level. Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. See, every word of the history of Rome has been written on a Mac. Every minute recorded into GarageBand, and for a while, almost every download came via iTunes. Everyone is entitled to their own opinions about the man, but just so you know, this podcast would literally not exist without the products and services that he bequeathed upon the world. Rest in peace, Steve, and thank you. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 163, Theodosius's Walls. We've spent the last 2 weeks focused primarily on the Western Empire during the first decade of the 400s AD. So before we just keep barreling along into the sack of Rome and the fall of Constantine III, I want to double back and bring the Eastern Empire up to speed. But, just so you know, as soon as we're caught up, we're going to head right back to the west because basically that's where all the action is right now. The thing to understand about the eastern half of the empire in the years after Theodosius' death is that though the eastern court was far less stable politically than the Stilicho-led western court, the eastern provinces as a whole were far more stable than the western provinces as a whole. The population migrations brought on by the Hunnic advance onto the Hungarian plain tended to drive displaced local barbarian tribes west rather than south, which meant, as we saw last week, that the western provinces wound up dealing with the consequences of those disruptive migrations. On top of that, Sassanid Persia had been peaceful since signing a treaty with Theodosius back in the 380s, a treaty that Stilicho helped broker, so the eastern legions could afford to focus on deflecting those barbarian migrations west instead of allowing them to come south. Indeed, in just a minute, Constantinople and the Sassanids will renew their peaceful terms, and that renewal will further stabilize the eastern provinces, both because it meant the Romans didn't have to pour resources into fighting the Persians, but also because it meant that the lucrative trade routes to and from Asia remained open for business. As we've seen, in the late 390s and early 400s, the Emperor Arcadius was dominated by a shifting cast of ministers and generals who focused on winning and holding power at least as much as they focused on actually governing the Eastern Empire. The only permanent political presence during these years was the Empress Eudoxia, whose influence over her husband never wavered while all these ministers rose and fell around her. In fact, the only real challenge to her authority came not from some ambitious prefect or powerful general, but from an incorruptible clergyman who had risen to become Bishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, also known as John the Golden Mouth. Though he would never achieve the same sort of political success that Ambrose of Milan had achieved, there were two critical similarities between the two men. First, both were fearless when it came to challenging imperial authority, and second, both were wildly popular with the masses. John tended towards a vow of poverty form of Christianity, and early in his life he had gone so far as to spend a few years living as an ascetic hermit. After nearly dying from his self-imposed deprivations, John returned to civilization and began preaching. He liked to use simple language to teach practical interpretations of Scripture, rather than using highfalutin rhetoric to teach snooze-inducing abstract philosophy, and he quickly became a favorite of the common people. Because of his popularity, John was tapped to become Bishop of Constantinople in 398, but at first he refused. He genuinely did not want to get caught up in the trappings of power that came along with such an important office. But when pressed, he relented, though he refused to temper his beliefs in any way. Extravagant lifestyles enjoyed by the ruling elite, and one of his favorite targets became Eudoxia, who was similarly unapologetic about said extravagant lifestyle. Pretty soon, the bishop's constant hammering began to have an effect, and the popularity of the empress fell precipitously. So in 403, Eudoxia finally decided she had had enough of this gadfly bishop, and so she organized a church council whose sole purpose was to oust John and replace him with someone more agreeable. But the empress underestimated John's popularity, and when the council completed its task and John was dumped from the bishopric, unrest bordering on riots broke out across Constantinople. Plus, on the very night that John was taken into imperial custody in advance of his expected banishment, an earthquake struck, which almost everyone, including the empress herself, took to be a sign of God's displeasure of how they had treated the bishop. He was released from custody and reinstated to his position at once. This brush with exile dampened John's spirit not at all. The very next year, a silver statue of Eudoxia was erected near the bishop's church, which sent him straight to the pulpit to denounce both the empress and her shiny new statue. This would prove to be the last straw, and when Eudoxia and her allies moved against John this time, there was no earthquake to make them think twice. The bishop was exiled from Constantinople, and despite a concerted campaign to recall him, he never would return. Unfortunately for the Empress, though, she would not have long to enjoy an uncritiqued life of luxury, because in mid-404, she died suddenly of a pregnancy-related infection. Though it's really not polite to dance on anyone's grave, objectively speaking, it's hard not to see Eudoxia's death as a net positive for the empire, because it cleared room for the new Praetorian prefect, Flavius Anthemius, to rise up and seize hold of power. Without a jealous empress around to potentially stab him in the back, Anthemius was able to dominate the Eastern emperors for the next decade, first Arcadius and then Theodosius II, and see to it that the empire was run with a consistent competence it had not enjoyed in years. Not only that, but Anthemius is more or less personally responsible for the Byzantine Empire holding out as long as it did, because as soon as he came to power, the prefect initiated one of the most important construction projects in world history, the building of the Theodosian Walls. Now, I have had the good fortune to stand atop the Theodosian Walls on 3 separate occasions, and I can tell you straight up that there is a reason Constantinople was simply invulnerable to overland assaults. When you approach the fortification line, there is a short initial wall to trip up you and your siege engines. That short wall stands in front of the much larger outer wall, which stands about 8 meters tall. Behind that much larger wall are huge towers about 20 meters tall that would be able to rain hell and damnation down on your head while you struggle valiantly to get over the top of the 8-meter wall. But once you're over the top of the 8-meter wall, the reality of your situation would have hit you full in the face, because about 20 meters beyond the 8-meter wall was an even larger wall, about 12 meters tall. All you've managed to do is plop yourself down in a no-man's-land trench filled with mud and debris that would stick you in place while the soldiers on top of the even bigger inner wall and the guard towers rained further hell and damnation down on your head. No one got out of that pit of despair alive. The Theodosian Walls would be completed around 414, during the reign of young Theodosius II, hence the name, and for the next 1,000 years, they would repel every attempt to take Constantinople by land. It took the invention of the cannon, and then the construction of literally the biggest cannon ever built by humans to finally break through. I've posted some pictures that we took of the walls during the first set of History of Rome tours up at the historyofrome.typepad.com. Honestly, my heart goes out to every foot soldier ever ordered by some megalomaniacal general to attack the Theodosian Walls. With the physical defense of the capital city taken care of, Anthemius then turned his attention to broader security concerns. As I just mentioned, historically speaking, the biggest threats to the Eastern Empire always came from the direction of Persia, first from the Parthians and then from the Sassanids. With the Huns now moving decisively onto the Hungarian plain, where they would pose a permanent threat to the northern border, Anthemius knew that any kind of conflict with the Sassanids would be disastrous. The Huns already posed enough of a threat that Anthemius had ordered a humongous wall built to guard Constantinople. If troops ever had to be peeled off to fight in Syria, I mean, that could have been the ballgame right there.